Barry Gibb gave the world Stayin Alive, How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever. Songs so perfect, they became the soundtrack of entire generations. Over 220 million records sold, 1,000 songs written, a legacy that defined an era. But there's something the world doesn't see when Barry Gibb takes the stage today. He's not standing there alone by choice. He's standing there alone because he's the only one left. Andy, dead at 30. Maurice, at 53. Robin, at 62. 3 brothers. 3 devastating losses. And Barry, at 78, carries the weight of a memory no one should have to carry alone. Because here's the truth. The man who brought joy to the entire world through music has spent the last decades drowning in grief behind the curtain. Every stage he sings on now is haunted by voices that no longer exist. Every harmony he tries to create is incomplete. And every time he closes his eyes, he sees the faces of 3 brothers who should be standing there with him. How did the band that sold more records than almost any other in history end up with a single survivor? What happened behind the scenes of fame that turned the most celebrated sound of the 70s into a family tragedy? And why does Barry Gibb, the last living Bee Gee, still sing alone on stages that once held 4 voices? Before we understand the weight Barry carries today, we need to go back to the beginning. Because the story of the Bee Gees didn't start with spotlights and gold records. It started with poverty, forced emigration, and 3 boys who sang not because they loved music, but because they needed to survive. Barry Allen Crompton. Gibb was born on September 1st, 1946, on the Isle of Man, a wind-swept island in the Irish Sea, where horizons felt endless, but opportunities did not. His father, Hugh Gibb, was a drummer and bandleader who chased gigs that never quite paid enough. His mother, Barbara, held the family together with love, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of a woman who knew hardship intimately. Barry was the first. Then came the twins, Robin and Maurice, born in 1949. And years later, in 1958, came Andy, the youngest, born after the family had already been scarred by struggle. They were not born into wealth or privilege. They were born into survival. By the time Barry was 9, the Gibb household was crumbling under financial strain. Hugh's music career couldn't feed 5 mouths. Creditors knocked. Utilities were cut. The family faced a choice: stay and sink, or risk everything on a desperate gamble. In 1958, they boarded a ship bound for Australia, leaving behind everything familiar for a country that promised nothing but a chance. Australia did not welcome them with open arms. It greeted them with poverty. The Gibbs settled in Redcliffe, Queensland, in a cramped house with peeling paint and broken dreams. Hugh worked menial jobs. Barbara cleaned houses. And the boys? The boys sang. It started small. Barry, Robin, and Maurice would harmonize in their tiny bedroom, their voices weaving together in a way that felt almost supernatural. Barry, even as a child, had a voice that cut through the air like light through darkness. Robin's vibrato was haunting, emotional. Maurice's tone was smooth, grounding. Together, they didn't just sing. They became something. Hugh noticed. He saw in his sons what the world had never seen in him: potential. He pushed them hard. At 12 years old, Barry was already performing in local clubs, earning spare change to help his family survive. "We didn't sing because we loved it," Barry would later confess. "We sang because we had to." By their early teens, the brothers were performing as the Bee Gees, a name borrowed from the initials of a local DJ, Bill Gates, and a promoter, Bill Good. It wasn't glamorous. They played speedway tracks, tiny theaters, working-class pubs where drunks heckled and the pay barely covered gas. But they were building something. A bond forged not just by blood, but by necessity. Then, in 1963, everything changed. Their song Spicks and Specks became a hit in Australia. Suddenly, the boys who once sang for survival were singing on national radio. Barry, the eldest, became the leader by default, writing lyrics, arranging harmonies, steering the group forward. He was only 17, but he carried the weight of 4 futures on his shoulders. By 1967, the Bee Gees returned to England, no longer desperate immigrants, but rising stars. Barry had tasted success, but he had no idea that the harmony he had built with his brothers would one day become the very thing that haunted him. When the Bee Gees returned to England in 1967, they were no longer the scrappy boys singing in Australian pubs. They were hungry, polished, and armed with songs that would soon rewrite music history. Their manager, Robert Stigwood, saw what others had missed. 3 brothers whose harmonies could make the world weep. Their first UK single, New York Mining Disaster, 1941, hit the charts like a ghost story set to melody. Radio stations played it constantly. Critics compared them to the Beatles. The world was listening. And Barry, now 20 years old, was writing songs with a maturity that defied his age. Then came Massachusetts in 1967. It topped the charts in the UK, across Europe, and became the anthem of a generation longing for something they couldn't name. Barry's voice, tender and aching, carried lyrics about homesickness and loss. But the song wasn't fiction. It was real. The Gibbs had spent years as outsiders, immigrants, nobodies. Massachusetts was their homecoming, not to a place, but to relevance. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, the hits kept coming. To Love Somebody, I Started a Joke. How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? Each song felt like a confession, raw and vulnerable. Barry wasn't just writing melodies. He was bleeding emotion onto tape. And the world felt it. But success came with fractures. The brothers fought. Egos clashed. Robin briefly left the group in 1969, convinced he could thrive solo. The split nearly destroyed them. Barry later admitted, losing Robin, even for a year, felt like losing a limb. We were never meant to be apart. When Robin returned in 1970, the reunion was fragile, but necessary. They were stronger together, and they knew it. Yet the music industry was shifting. Disco was rising, and the Bee Gees, once darlings of soft rock ballads, were being left behind. Record sales declined. Tours grew smaller. By 1974, they were on the edge of irrelevance. Then came the miracle. In 1975, producer Arif Mardin suggested they experiment with R&B rhythms and falsetto vocals. Barry was hesitant. His falsetto had always been a tool, not a trademark. But he tried. And when he sang Jive Talkin' in that soaring, urgent register, everything changed. The song exploded. It hit #1. And suddenly, the Bee Gees weren't just relevant again. They were unstoppable. In 1977, Robert Stigwood asked them to write songs for a small film about Brooklyn nightlife called Saturday Night Fever. Barry wrote Stayin Alive in one night. How Deep Is Your Love followed shortly after. Night Fever came next. The brothers recorded the album in a blur of inspiration, late nights, and brotherhood that felt unshakable. The film premiered, and the world exploded. Saturday Night Fever didn't just dominate the charts, it became the charts. The soundtrack sold over 40 million copies, making it one of the best-selling albums of all time. The Bee Gees had 6 songs in the top 10 simultaneously. Barry's falsetto became the sound of an era. Disco wasn't just a genre anymore. It was a cultural phenomenon, and the Bee Gees were its kings. By 1979, Barry Gibb stood at the absolute peak of the music world. He had fame, wealth, adoration. He had written songs that would outlive him. He had his brothers by his side, their harmonies tighter than ever. The boy from the Isle of Man, who once sang for survival, was now immortal. But immortality, as Barry would soon learn, comes with a devastating price. At the height of their glory, the Bee Gees controlled the world. But the world, as Barry would soon discover, does not forgive those who shine too brightly for too long. By 1979, disco had become more than music. It had become a cultural flashpoint, and the Bee Gees, the undisputed kings of the genre, became its most visible targets. The backlash arrived with shocking ferocity. Radio stations held disco demolition nights, where fans were encouraged to burn Bee Gees records in bonfires. At Chicago's Comiskey Park, 50,000 people gathered to watch a DJ detonate a crate of disco albums, chanting "Disco sucks" as flames rose into the night sky. It wasn't just music criticism. It was personal. It was vicious. The Bee Gees were mocked, ridiculed, dismissed as a joke. Rock purists despised them. Critics called their music soulless. Their falsetto, once celebrated as revolutionary, was now derided as effeminate, weak, unmanly. Radio stations blacklisted them. MTV refused to play their videos. Barry later confessed, "We went from heroes to zeros overnight. It felt like the entire world turned on us." The 3 brothers who had harmonized their way from poverty to immortality suddenly found themselves outcasts in an industry they had dominated. Tours were canceled, album sales plummeted, and the isolation was suffocating. But the cruelty of the public was nothing compared to the battles being waged inside the Gibb family itself. Maurice, the middle brother, had always been the peacekeeper, the quiet glue that held Barry and Robin together when egos flared. But behind his easygoing demeanor, Maurice was drowning. The pressure of fame, the relentless touring, the constant expectation to deliver perfection. It all became unbearable. He turned to alcohol. At first, it was casual. Then it became survival. Then it became addiction. By the early 1980s, Maurice was drinking so heavily that he could barely function. He showed up to recording sessions drunk. He missed interviews. His marriage to singer Lulu collapsed under the weight of his addiction. Barry and Robin watched helplessly as their brother spiraled, unable to pull him back from the edge. "We didn't know how to save him," Barry admitted years later, his voice breaking. "We were too busy trying to survive ourselves." The 3 brothers, once inseparable, began to fracture. Arguments became brutal. Robin, always the most sensitive, felt sidelined by Barry's leadership. He accused Barry of being controlling, dictatorial. Barry, exhausted and defensive, accused Robin of being ungrateful. Maurice, caught in the middle, drank to numb the chaos. The harmony that had once been their superpower was now tearing them apart. Then there was Andy. The youngest Gibb brother had followed in his siblings' footsteps, launching a solo career in the late 1970s. With Barry's guidance and songwriting, Andy became a sensation, scoring massive hits like "I Just Want to Be Your Everything" and "Shadow Dancing." For a brief moment, it seemed like the Gibb magic was generational, unstoppable. But Andy, like Maurice, could not handle the pressure. Fame at 19 years old came with drugs, excess, and an industry that chewed up young stars, and spat them out broken. By the early 1980s, Andy was battling cocaine addiction. His career collapsed. His health deteriorated. And Barry, watching from a distance, felt the crushing guilt of a big brother who couldn't protect the baby of the family. "I saw it happening," Barry said later, his voice haunted. "I saw him falling, and I didn't know how to catch him." By the mid-1980s, the Bee Gees were no longer the kings of music. They were survivors clinging to wreckage, waiting for the next wave to either lift them up or drown them completely. And the next wave, when it came, would be the most devastating of all. March 10th, 1988. The phone call came in the early hours of the morning. Barry Gibb, asleep in his Miami home, was jolted awake by a ring that would shatter his world forever. On the other end of the line, a voice delivered the words no brother should ever hear. Andy was dead. Andy Gibb, the golden boy with the angelic voice, the youngest brother who had once seemed destined for greatness, was gone at just 30 years old. The official cause was myocarditis, inflammation of the heart, triggered by years of cocaine abuse. But to Barry, the cause was simpler and more devastating. Fame had killed him. Barry had watched it happen in slow motion. Throughout the early 1980s, as Andy's career crumbled and his addiction worsened, Barry tried everything. He brought Andy into the studio, hoping music could save him. He staged interventions. He pleaded, argued, and begged. But addiction doesn't listen to love. And fame, once it breaks you, rarely lets you heal. In his final years, Andy was a ghost of himself. His once bright eyes were hollow. His performances were erratic. He had lost recording contracts, relationships, and finally, his will to fight. By 1987, he was living in near obscurity, broke and broken, trying desperately to claw his way back. He had just been cast in a stage production of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat in England. A chance, a lifeline, a hope that maybe redemption was still possible. But 5 days before opening night, his heart gave out. Barry flew to England immediately. He stood at Andy's bedside in the hospital, staring at the body of his baby brother, the boy he had mentored, protected, and loved. "I felt like I'd failed him," Barry would later admit, his voice cracking with guilt that would never fully fade. "He looked up to me his whole life, and I couldn't save him." The funeral was unbearable. Andy was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Barry, Robin, and Maurice stood together, 3 brothers now mourning a 4th who should have outlived them all. The harmonies that had once been 4 voices were now reduced to 3. And for the first time, Barry understood a truth that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Success could not protect the people he loved. Andy's death didn't just break Barry's heart, it broke his faith. In interviews afterward, Barry's tone changed. The confidence, the swagger, the defiance that had once defined him. All of it was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier. "Music took everything from us," he said, in a rare moment of raw honesty. "It gave us the world, but it took my brother." Maurice spiraled deeper into alcoholism after Andy's death. The guilt, the grief, the overwhelming sense that they had all failed their youngest brother. It consumed him. Robin retreated into himself, distant and unreachable. And Barry? Barry threw himself into work, because work was the only thing that didn't remind him of the silence where Andy's laughter used to be. But the music felt different now. Every song Barry wrote carried the shadow of loss. Every time he sang, he heard Andy's voice echoing in the harmonies that were no longer there. The Bee Gees continued recording through the 1990s, albums like High Civilization and Still Waters, but the joy was gone. They were no longer chasing glory. They were running from grief. Andy's death also changed how Barry saw fame. He became protective, almost paranoid, about his own children pursuing music. "I didn't want them anywhere near this industry," he admitted. "I'd seen what it cost. I'd buried the proof." For years, Barry carried the weight of Andy's death like a stone in his chest. He would replay their last conversations, searching for signs he missed, words he should have said, moments he could have changed. But the past is unchangeable, and Andy was gone. What Barry didn't know yet, what he couldn't have imagined in 1988, was that Andy's death was only the beginning. The cruelest chapters were still to come. Barry thought he had learned how to survive loss. Andy's death in 1988 had carved a permanent scar, but 15 years had passed. 15 years of healing, of rebuilding, of believing the worst was behind him. Then January 12, 2003 arrived, and Barry learned that grief has no mercy, no limits, and no end. Maurice Gibb, the quiet peacekeeper, the brother who had held them together through every storm, collapsed at his home in Miami. A twisted intestine, something so sudden, so random, so preventable, turned into a medical emergency. He was rushed to the hospital. Surgery was performed. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Then his heart stopped. Maurice died on January 12, 2003, at 53 years old. Barry received the call and felt the ground vanish beneath him. Not Maurice, not the brother who had been there since the beginning, whose bass lines and harmonies had been the foundation of every Bee Gees song. Not the man who had finally beaten his demons, who had found sobriety, love, and peace in his final years. It felt like being torn in half, Barry said later, barely able to form the words. At Maurice's funeral, Barry stood with Robin, the two remaining brothers, and realized with crushing finality, the Bee Gees were over. The group that had defined their lives, that had given the world so much joy, could not exist with only two voices. The magic was gone. Barry and Robin tried to continue. They recorded together, performed a few times, but every note was haunted. Every harmony felt incomplete, like a sentence missing its final word. "We couldn't do it without Mo," Barry admitted. It wasn't the Bee Gees anymore. It was just two brothers pretending. Then, in 2010, Robin was diagnosed with colon and liver cancer. Barry watched, helpless once again, as another brother began to fade. Robin fought with everything he had: surgeries, chemotherapy, experimental treatments. But cancer is merciless. For 2 years, Barry stayed by Robin's side, holding on to hope, even as Robin's body weakened, even as the hospital visits became more frequent, even as the end became inevitable. On May 20th, 2012, Robin Gibb died at 62 years old. Barry was now the last one standing, the eldest brother, the leader, the survivor. But survival felt like punishment. He had buried Andy at 41, Maurice at 56, Robin at 65. 3 brothers, 3 unbearable goodbyes. And Barry, now alone, carried the weight of their entire legacy on shoulders that had never felt more fragile. "I'm the last man standing," Barry said in an interview shortly after Robin's death, his voice hollow. "And I don't know why. Why me? Why not them?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Barry Gibb, the voice of a generation, was now a voice singing in an empty room. In 2025, Barry Gibb is 78 years old. His hair is silver, his frame thinner than the swaggering figure who once commanded stages in white suits and gold chains. but his voice, that unmistakable falsetto, remains. Weathered, yes, fragile at times, but still capable of breaking hearts. He lives quietly now, splitting time between his homes in Miami and England, surrounded by his wife Linda, his children, and his grandchildren. The empire of fame he once ruled feels distant, almost like a dream belonging to someone else. "I don't chase the spotlight anymore," Barry admits softly. "I've seen what it costs." But Barry has not abandoned music. He cannot. Music is the only language he has left to speak with his brothers. In 2016, Barry embarked on what he called his final solo tour, Mythology. Night after night, he stood alone on stages that once held 4 Gibbs. He sang Stayin Alive, How Deep Is Your Love to Love Somebody. But now, every song was a eulogy. Behind him, massive screens projected images of Andy, Maurice, and Robin, their faces flickering like ghosts, their voices woven into the recording so that, for a few precious minutes, the Bee Gees were whole again. Audiences wept openly. So did Barry. "I sing to keep them alive," he confessed after one show, his voice breaking. "Every night, I hear their harmonies. I see them standing beside me. And for those 2 hours, they're not gone. We're brothers again." The tour was both triumph and torment. Critics praised his resilience, his artistry, his refusal to let age silence him. But Barry knew the truth. He wasn't performing for applause. He was performing because stopping would mean letting them disappear forever. Yet even as Barry carries the past, he has also begun to release it. In recent years, he has stepped back, allowing his sons, Stephen, Ashley, and Michael, to pursue their own musical paths. Unlike his own father, who pushed relentlessly, Barry has been gentle, protective. "I tell them the truth," he says. "Fame is beautiful and brutal. It gives everything and takes everything. If they choose it, I'll support them, but I won't push them into the fire." Barry has also turned his wealth and influence toward legacy beyond music. He has donated millions to children's hospitals, cancer research, and programs supporting young musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds. "I can't bring my brothers back," he says quietly, "but maybe I can help someone else's brother survive." In 2020, Barry was awarded a knighthood by Queen Elizabeth II, becoming Sir Barry Gibb. It was an honor that should have been shared with Robin and Maurice, both of whom were made commanders of the British Empire before they died. Standing in Buckingham Palace, Barry felt the absence like a wound. "I wished they were there," he admitted later. "Every honor I receive feels incomplete without them." His home is a museum of memory. Gold records line the walls. Guitars once played by Maurice sit untouched. Photos of the 4 brothers, young, invincible, together, hang in every room. Barry walks past them daily, each image a reminder of what was and what can never be again. Friends say he speaks to his brothers often, aloud, as if they're still in the room. "I'll ask Maurice what he thinks of a melody," Barry admits without embarrassment. "I'll tell Robin a joke. I know it sounds crazy, but it's the only way I can carry on." The world still celebrates the Bee Gees. Their music streams billions of times. Saturday Night Fever remains iconic. New generations discover Stayin Alive and dance without knowing the sorrow behind the song. And Barry watches, grateful that the music endures, even as the men who made it have faded into memory. But late at night, when the house is quiet and the world is asleep, Barry sits at his piano. He plays the old songs, the ones that made them legends, the ones that cost them everything. And in those moments, he is not Sir Barry Gibb, not the last surviving Bee Gee, not the voice of a generation. He is simply a brother, singing into the darkness, hoping somehow, somewhere, three voices answer back. "I'm the last one left," Barry says, his eyes distant, haunted. "And I'll keep singing until I'm not."